What's the worst coworker you've ever worked with? Story 1. I had a manager once who dumped trash on my desk my third day there. She said it was to remind me that taking out the trash was part of my job description. It wasn't. I was a research assistant at a mortgage firm. Story 2. Context. I work in a hospital as a nurse's aide, and my department focuses on transporting patients around the facility for tests and room changes. I work night shift, and this person started their shift at 6 a.m. There was this lady I worked with that just had the nastiest attitude. Normally I can get along with most folks, but this person just brought the whole room down with negative vibes. Nothing was ever good, and she always had bad shifts. One thing she did that upset a lot of people was take patients down for x-rays and leave them down there to return to our office. The big thing to remember here is that even the lengthiest x-rays take maybe 10 minutes at the very most, 2 to 5 mins on average for the scans. Every morning we got x-rays to do, and I had to send her back down to return patients to their rooms after the x-ray technicians called right as she got back to our office. The instances of leaving patients were common, so I informed my boss several times in person and email. Apparently she had an attitude with every other department we worked with and never informed nurses that we were moving their patients. Big no-no when meds and vital signs need to be done. One day she had abandoned a patient in the ER waiting room when they were waiting for a ride home, and told no one, so security had found a patient just sitting alone for 15-30 mins without supervision. It took this and a year of recorded evidence for this person to finally get fired. When that happened, it's like a dark cloud lifted, and a lot of people were relieved. Oh, and she tried to get various employees around the facility to sign a form to argue against her case. One person signed. Story 3. I have several bad ones, but the one that drives me the most crazy is a lady who creates problems just so she can solve them. She takes a simple job, finds the one tiny issue, blows that up and freaks everyone out, and then solves it so she can be the hero. Just take the 1 minute to fix the issue in the first place. It would save the literal hours she spends working everyone up so she can be their savior. Story 4. I worked at Starbucks for a year, one of the very worst years of my life. And while I was there, had a coworker named Eric. I was at the till the day Eric came in with his resume, and there under his name he had typed Architect of Imagination. Eric was an aspiring writer, but he had trouble stringing a sentence together. He couldn't be on the machine because he couldn't remember how to use it or how any single drink was made. He couldn't be a support role because he had no way of predicting or understanding what anyone else on the floor needed or even was saying. He couldn't be on register because he couldn't mark a cup, and even our most patient customers would inevitably raise their voices at his incompetence. Reliably, he would genuinely look like he was about to cry. I was so torn between rage and pity. He made a terrible job so much harder, but he was just so breathtakingly, pitifully, shockingly dumb. I have never met anyone like him, before or since. One night I was thinking about something particularly vicious I had said in response to something particularly baffling Eric had done, and found myself wondering about his life outside of our store. Was the world scary and confusing to Eric? Did it seem like life was just happening to him? I imagined him standing in traffic, looking vaguely surprised and confused, forgetting how he had gotten there. I looked him up on Facebook and was pretty disturbed by what I found. Eric didn't look awkward or scared on Facebook. He looked stylish, suave. He had product in his hair. Beautiful women in expensive-looking clothes smiled in his photos. Several posted on his wall, expressing what a good time they'd had with him recently, often citing a writing sesh. It felt like I was on a different plane. It felt like I was having a stroke. So then my question became, who is Eric, and who is scamming whom? The popular theory in the store was that Eric was essentially a method actor, doing research for a book or script. I came close to asking him about it a few times, but I was so afraid that I was wrong. I imagined myself over and over asking, are you a method actor, or are you really and truly this stupid? It just wasn't something I could bring myself to risk. I wonder about him all the time, actually, and who he might be terrorizing today. Story 5. When I was an intern, there was this old shrew who would call people into her office. My cube shared a thin wall. Gossip. Then call those people in to tell them what was said, etc. She would try to frame people for she did wrong. She was so arrogant, and she refused to adapt to workforce modernization. Example, she refused to learn how to hyperlink in emails, documents, etc. A real ray of sunshine she was. Story 6. My worst coworker was one I worked with when I was a cashier at Walmart. She approached me and asked me to cash out her paycheck. I was still new at the job and never got training on how to do that function. She was sympathetic, so she walked me through how to do it. Transaction over and done, I go on about my day. I get called back a couple of days later by my managers, and they circled me in an office and accused me of stealing. After tears, videotapes, and telling them what happened, they told me that apparently this coworker of mine had stolen not only from me, but several other people that day as well. They just wanted to confirm I wasn't in on the deal. Walmart and that bitch for almost getting me arrested. Story 7. No contest. It was the literal crackhead I worked with for 4 months that was also secretly living in the office and being completely nonsensical when he was actually working. We found a mattress folded up in the warehouse after he was let go, and an actual brand new crack pipe with a price tag on it to boot, squirreled away back there. He and his family, not just him living in the office, left discarded food everywhere like pizza crusts in the toilet brush holder in the bathroom. What even? And they left hair in the sink in the bathroom as they were obviously bathing in there too, as we had no actual bathing facilities in the office. One day during his tenure, he sent an email saying his alarm didn't go off and he'd be in at X time, which kept getting moved back later and later. He eventually showed up at 4:40 p.m. and we closed at 5 p.m. LOL. See comment above about secretly living in the office. There's so much more I could go into. It was a wild 4 months, that's for sure. Edit. This blew up in a way I did not anticipate, and I've gotten a few responses that I'm making this up. But let me tell you, I really wish that I were. His girlfriend was always around at work, and she would move in a way that you would absolutely never see her face. We thought maybe she had a warrant out for her arrest or something. I think only one of us saw her actual face, and she would also sit behind the warehouse bay door in their Nissan Altima, with it running all day for the AC when she wasn't back there with him. He wanted us to hire her to help him, which wasn't happening. Our warehouse area was concrete flooring, which didn't get cleaned often at all, and she'd walk around back there barefoot. As mentioned before, he was completely nonsensical at work as well. He suggested to my coworker, who scans our old documents to PDF via a feeder on our copier, of course, that she should take a picture of each page with her cell phone and do it that way. I got multiple emails from him that made no sense at all, and I eventually had to just forward some to my boss so he could see what was going on. It was a sad situation, but also a WTF situation for the rest of us. He brought his GF to the interview and asked if she could sit in on it because it was so hot outside. Now, if we didn't have a Walmart and a huge shopping center within spitting distance, that might have made sense, but that was pretty unprofessional, and they still hired him. All we did was lose money by employing him. He worked on one pro bono job we did and managed to that up. Story waiting is hired a cook on a good recommendation. He was just fine the first 2 weeks. Then I noticed food going missing. Then supplies started going missing. Then a customer told me that he had been adding auto 30% tips his food purchases. When I looked at the books, I saw that he had been adding 30% tips to all the credit card sales, and the cash rings were off from what should have been sold. I fired him that day. The next day he came in and apologized. Said he was on and was going to rehab. I wished him well. The next day he tried to break in after close and was caught. Story 9. I worked in childcare, and they had hired a new assistant or trainee teacher for my room. Each room has 2 teachers. She just constantly argued about the dumbest shit and always tried to argue with me about both company and state childcare policies because that's dumb. Also was late every day her first week there. It all just started adding up until I was changing diapers, and she was holding a 2-to-1-year-old child on her lap. I see a child biting another child and say, "You need to go help them," as I have a child in the middle of a very explosive poopy diaper change up on the changing table and can't leave him there, obviously. She doesn't get up. I repeat it, and she says, "Well, I have this kid on my lap." So I say, "Take him off your lap." She responds, "He's strong." Like this grown-ass adult is unable to move a 2-year-old off her lap because of some weird super strength. Then the child bites the other child again, and at that point I'm mad and tell her to get up and help them now. She then proceeds to say, "So what, I have to watch these 4 kids while you just have one up on the table?" Like I'm somehow supposed to have multiple children on the table at once to make her job of sitting on the floor making sure kids don't get bit twice in a row easier, and our ratios were 4.1 anyways. I finished my diaper change, stuck my head out the door to my supervisor and told her, "Get this lady out of my room," and they did after, and wrote her up after reviewing the footage of the incident. She was fired for no call, no showing the next week. I've worked with a lot of idiots in childcare, but she was so in such a short amount of time. Story 10. The HR manager at my last job had 0 training, education, or experience in HR. She was argumentative, passive-aggressive, and incompetent. Toward the end, she asked me, Why are you being resistant? And you're not being a team player. When I was advocating for client safety, I was the second person in less than a year to leave and hire an attorney. Story 11. I've worked a lot of factories, but one I worked at was mainly for felons. The pay you complete and work you so hard, it tears you body and mind up. I just graduated high school and it was my second factory, so I didn't know any better. One guy I work with, we nicknamed Big Matt since we already had another Matt. Well, Big Matt was a big fan of crystal and steroids, so the dude was absolutely jacked, but this 35-year still lived with his mom. He said it had to do with him being a kid and walking in her being raped, and ever since then, he never wanted to leave her alone. At the time, I thought, wow, that would explain the substance abuse. He just wants to be strong to protect her. Well, 2 months later, Big Matt and two coworkers didn't show up, so I asked the supervisor what happened, but he didn't know either. Next day, one of the coworkers came in and told us that all three had been arrested because after buying an O of E, Big Matt's mom called the cops on them. So before the cops showed up, Big Matt, a 6-foot, some odd inch buff meth head, beat his mother within an inch her life for calling the cops on him. Next day, I looked him up, and sure enough, he was booked in a local prison. Suppose that has to be the worst coworker out of all the ones I've faced. Story 12. This is about 15 years ago, but the office I worked in instituted a scent-free policy. One woman who was already insufferable was so offended by it that she snuck in her perfume collection. She'd walk down the halls and spray perfume into empty offices or cubicles when no one was looking or before everyone arrived in the morning. This went on for well over a month or two, and we had no idea who was responsible. My coworkers and I started referring to this mysterious person as the Chanel Bandit. She was finally caught on camera in the act. She'd left for 3 weeks vacation and was unaware that we had installed cameras after a break-in. Some of us already suspected her, as the Chanel Bandit mysteriously stopped spraying while she was away. She quit right after she was caught. None of us were sad to see that cedar-scented psycho leave. Story 13. He would walk in every day like it was his first day with no memory of anything we showed him the previous day. He was only focused for the first 30 minutes, then the rest of the time would be on his phone and try to work with one hand, which is bad because I work in a restaurant. Can't cook with one hand, but that didn't stop him from trying. Then one day he just stopped showing up for like a week, then was confused when he came back and was fired. Edit. I'm not sure if he had memory issues or anything like that. At least he didn't tell us or the owner. He did, however, like to talk about how easy our job was because he'd had 4 other restaurant jobs before this one. He was only 19, but we didn't make him do anything complicated, but he would forget easy things, like where we kept burger buns or where buttons were on the register. Also, he always left trash laying around after he was done with a job. It would be me and my other coworkers who cleaned up after him, and his excuse was always that he didn't think it mattered, because it was going to get cleaned up eventually. He still comes in every once in a while to watch our TV, sometimes with friends and sometimes by himself. He never buys anything, but he just does it quietly so no one bothers him. Story 14. I worked with a guy who couldn't learn new skills. When he started, he had to learn new programs and processes, just like anyone would at almost any job. He couldn't pick up on it, whether it was where to click in a software to get a certain result or how to fill out a report. Everyone on my team took turns showing him the ropes, and it never sunk in. I remember being so frustrated because he could not figure out how to minimize a window. Top right corner, click on the straight line. It took like 3 to 4 seconds for him to drag the mouse to the corner, and then he'd hover around it, but never on it. Super nice guy, but impossible to work and collaborate with on projects because so much time was wasted. Story 15. I worked with someone in retail. He was my boss, and not a particularly bad guy, but he was a control freak who had to interject his opinion during every conversation anyone was having with a customer. This also went as far as him being in the middle of helping someone himself, stopping helping that customer to lean over to my till, to help me with my transaction, even though there was no indication I needed help and had worked there for over 5 years. This help would be in the form of him telling me what button to hit next on the till, to telling a customer they were wrong to have any given opinion on a topic, to telling customers that their choice of entertainment they were purchasing wasn't what they were after, even if they specifically came into the store for that specific item. He was also lazy as. Not a bad guy, but holy hell do I not miss working with him. Story 16, I worked in a certain touring exhibition last summer. It's not Potter, FYI. And of 200 people who were applying for jobs, 20 of us got the job. We were all close-knit and had a love for the exhibit content, and being all genuinely interesting people made us a family. Bar one woman. She thought she was the world's biggest star for having a 3-second cameo on Guillot and sent harassing messages and calls to many of us. She sexually harassed a lovely guy on the shop team who had no interest, undermined the bosses constantly, talked back, was rude to customers. When she thought we talked about her behind her back, she got defensive and spiteful. We didn't. One day she got knocked back for good by the shop guy, and for some reason decided to take it out on me. Started slabbering about me around to every other coworker, but never to my face. She called me a white snake. Now I am albino and my hair color got me seriously bullied in school along the vein of her insults. So her name calling was very hurtful. I had enough and took it to HR, and she was fired for her actions. I could go on, but she doesn't deserve any more thought. Story 17. I worked with a guy who'd interrupt any conversation to talk about anything as if he was the expert. And I don't use anything as a hyperbole. He truly had something to say about anything, including things he had never heard of or obviously didn't know much about. When the subject being discussed was something in the category of things he didn't know much about, he would slowly steer the conversation away from the original discussion to something he would like to talk about at the moment. It was both amazing and the most annoying thing I had ever had to deal with. He was like that Wikipedia game where you start with Star Wars and somehow end up on LGBTQ struggles. Not to mention the conversation was basically 98% of him just talking nonstop. Everybody else was way too polite and against conflict to say anything, including me. So most people just tried to stay away from him, but he'd follow people around. I eventually left, but I even remember having a nightmare where he was the best man at my wedding. Story 18. His name was Dan. Dan was 37, working at a dead-end job as a lab specimen processor in a windowless room for 9 hours a day. He ate only Burger King, but without the lettuce because that's rabbit food. He drank literally a gallon of Mountain Dew a day and was confused as to why people were horrified by that. There's water in it, he would say. Apparently, if he ate corn, he would vomit and have to go to the hospital. He would tell me he firmly believed that man and dinosaur roamed the earth at the same time, along with many other theories that came from his gut. One day, we got into a political argument before the 2016 election where he said, "If Bernie Sanders is elected president, there will be a civil war, and I will not hesitate to kill you and your family." Dan was fired. I got out of there as soon as I could. Don't be like Dan. Story 19. My old supervisor. She was that special brand of too nice. Laughing was her nervous tick, and hoo boy was constant. She was incapable of being assertive, which is not the best quality for someone whose job is telling other people what to do. The best she could do was be passive-aggressively nice when she really needed something done, which just made everyone dislike her. Story 20. My current supervisor and head supervisor, we work in the MRDD field. I got a call one Tuesday morning, and my boss was slurring her words and telling me to bring her hangover food. I show up about 20 minutes before my scheduled shift, and when I walked in, she could not stand up straight, and all you could smell was alcohol. Our head supervisor leaves, and she fully confesses that she was absolutely trashed and that she had been drinking from 9 p.m. Monday night to Tuesday at 12 p.m., with our head supervisor on the clock. She then proceeded to sleep and leave me to care for 4 individuals for 8 hours while she was still on the clock. That following Thursday, I show up to work again, and she got on my face. And again, it smelled like a bar. She told me that if I told anyone, I would lose my job and licenses. That weekend, she tried to force me to work a 3P to 4A shift because someone had a fever and couldn't come in. When I told her I was not required to cover anything outside of my shift without prior consent, she screamed again in my face and told me to just leave. I called my head supervisor, and I haven't heard anything still. 2 weeks later, I ended up breaking my foot on my weekend off, and I called her from the hospital Sunday afternoon, telling her I have to have the next 48 hours off to somewhat start the healing process, and she refused that and put me on light duty. I show up Monday afternoon, 26 hours after I got the proper medical care for my foot, and said something about my foot hurting, and she told me, "Well, a chunky girl of your size can't carry your own weight. I'm not small, but I'm happy where I am. And my weight has nothing to do with the fact that I had broken a bone less than 48 hours ago, and only 24 hours with medical care." And she then proceeded to leave me alone with a seizure patient who put herself on the floor, and I had to pick her up. She came back in around 9:30 p.m. to put them into bed, and she was drinking again. Story 21. Back when I worked at a restaurant, I was friends with the bartender. Chill dude. Right up until they made him manager. And that small amount of power and increase in pressure made him so angry all the time. He screamed at me that I was at my job because I didn't do a thing that I've never been asked to do before. He made me miss my last bus so I couldn't get home. It was pitch black outside, and I cried on the bench outside the restaurant. Worst working day and worst coworker. It took me a long time to get over that and realize I wasn't a worker. He was just stressed and didn't know how to handle it, I suppose. Story 22. I worked with a teacher that sat at his desk the entire year. Kids walked in and out whenever they wanted to. They did practically no work. He told racist jokes and was terrible with the students. One day I was sitting in the teacher workroom and another teacher noticed a phone on the counter. She asked if it was mine. When I said no, we looked at the lock screen to see whose it might be. The picture on the lock screen was of someone's bare tits. A few minutes later, the bad coworker walked in and picked it up. Needless to say, he was let go. Story 23. For a few summers, in high school and college, I worked as a groundskeeper at a large hotel complex. As a seasonal employee, I was paired up with the year-round full-time groundskeeper during my shifts, and then he and I would work alternate weekends. He retired suddenly when I was at school, so by the time I returned for the summer, they had hired a replacement. Ed was a lateral hire, having previously worked in the hotel's kitchens. He was in his 50s, but based on his maturity and intelligence, he wasn't more than a teenager. I heard some rumblings about him being a little off, but didn't pay them much mind, since I knew I'd be spending the whole summer with this guy and didn't want to go into our relationship with any preconceptions about him. The first thing I discovered was that he was dumber than a box of rocks. He used words he didn't know the meaning of, so of course they didn't make sense the way he used them. Whenever the subject of music would come up, he'd never fail to mention that he didn't like that rap crap bullshit. 15 years later, and I can still hear him saying that phrase. He laughed at the dumbest little things. He put an ice cube on my seat in our golf cart, which we used to get around the property, and I'd sit on it, notice it instantly, and stand up and brush the seat off. Wouldn't even get my pants wet, but he'd laugh his ass off as if it was the prank of the century. Our golf carts had roofs on them. It only takes one time to bang your head on it in order to avoid doing it again. But not for Ed. The first time he hit his head was a doozy. He had to stand there crouched over for a few minutes to regain his composure. He whacked it so hard, I felt really bad for him. A few days later, he did it again, and I was again concerned, but it became a weekly occurrence. My reactions went from concerned to confused. How does this guy keep doing this? To amused. By the end of the summer, I would lose my laughing whenever he hit his head. There was no other way to react than to laugh. If this guy didn't learn the first dozen times he hit his head, then there was no hope for him. One time, Ed was helping the boss move an extension ladder. They lifted it up and put it on the roof of a golf cart. The ladder was longer than the cart, so it stuck out both the front and the back sides of the cart. No sooner did he place his end on the roof, he turned away, then turned back and walked face first into the ladder, exactly where he just put it. My boss asked him if he was okay, but then as his mind processed what just happened, he asked Ed how he ran into the ladder he just put there. His immaturity was the next thing I noticed. Jokes, comments at a frequency that made me think I was back in middle school. One day we had these iron stakes in the back of the cart. We were driving around and Ed grabbed one of the stakes and let it drag on the ground like you would a stick on a fence as you walk by to make noise, making a scraping noise on the asphalt. It was annoying AF. I asked him to stop, so he lifted it up, waited 10 seconds, then started dragging it again. I again asked him to stop, which he did again and restarted shortly after. That particular day, I wasn't in the mood for his bullshit, so I just stopped the cart in the middle of the street, took the key, and walked away. He ran after me and begged me to come back and that he wouldn't do it again. Fortunately, he didn't. My coworkers told me stories about how he was on the days I wasn't there. More of the same. Constantly tripping over stuff, falling downstairs, banging his head. They eventually started referring to him as Homer Simpson because he was such a doofus. I could feel myself getting dumber every day I spent with him. His childish antics drove me insane. By the end of the summer, I had had enough. I decided to find a new job for the following year because I knew I couldn't spend another summer with him. Last I heard, Ed got injured by getting his arm stuck in the cardboard baler and couldn't work for several months. How he did that, I will never know, since you can't turn those things on unless the safety gate is closed, so it's not like it was running when it happened. He ultimately was never medically cleared to return to work, so I don't know what became of him. I was Facebook friends with him when I was in college, but got sick of all the Candy Crush and Farmville invitations from him that I just unfriended him. Story 24, it's my time to shine. Sorry it's long. About 2 years ago, I started work as a receptionist in an audiology clinic, so we do hearing aids and hearing tests. The only thing I knew about hearing aids before I took this job was that my grandpa had one. 8 months after I started, so at this point I have 8 months of experience with anything related to hearing, they hired a new provider who I would later discover knew nothing about anything. Not hearing aids, not basic, you should know this if you've had a job ever, not how to handle talking to bosses, patients, people over the phone, etc. Example, we had one patient who left her hearing aids with us to be fixed. She would call every once in a while to check on them, and I would say, I'll ask the provider to call you and update you, which I did. 4 months later, the same patient calls, and I discover the provider had been ignoring me every time I told her to call the patient, and she just straight up didn't call her ever. Another example, she could never ever remember to clock in and out, ever. It was a daily struggle with her. She would have to send in time card adjustments like every day, and then complain to me when our boss was annoyed. She didn't know to fill out repair forms, so every time we had to send something out, I would have to double check and make sure everything was filled out correctly and legibly. Again, she is the provider who is credentialed in this field, and I'm the receptionist who has 8 MOA's experience with hearing aids. She wouldn't do chart notes for weeks, literally. She would have patient charts stacked in the corner of her office for days, forget to make chart notes, put in the incorrect dates, spell the patient's name wrong, so I would have to double-check every chart before putting it back on the shelves. If she didn't know what to do with a patient, which was common, she would just do nothing. So I would have to pick up all of that slack, deal with the patients, take their complaints, talk to manufacturers over the phone. There were even times where I had to recommend hearing aids to patients because she just wouldn't. She would constantly forget to have patients sign paperwork. I would put a post-it on the chart, patient must sign, I would tell her beforehand, and yet she would still let them leave without signing purchase agreements and medical waivers. She could not keep track of the time. She would be going 10-30 minutes over appointment times, and I would have to deal with the pissed-off patient. I would tell her, hey, time warning, and she'd say, okay, and then ignore me. She would keep elderly patients in for her new patient appointments for like 2 or more hours, usually an hour-and-a-half appointment. Sometimes patients would have to tell her they needed to leave because they were tired or their feet hurt. These people are in their 80s. And the best, everything that went wrong was my fault. She would blame me for her poor job performance, her inability to retain patients and sell hearing aids, everything. After 6 months of this, I finally spoke up. I hadn't said anything up to this point because she was a really nice person apart from work, and I felt bad for her. But everyone has their limits, and also our company was starting to zero in on her because she wasn't making them any money. She was put on daily Zoom meetings with our boss and trainers. When this happened, they finally realized why she was making almost zero money. She was super incompetent OBVs, and they fired her. They told her they were shutting down the clinic altogether, but instead they hired a new provider with loads more education, experience, someone who is confident and young and knows how an iPhone works. The only thing I got from this experience was a 30-cent raise at the end of the year and a major increases in my anxiety med dosage. Also, I guess I learned a lot about my job, LOL. Also, the new provider and I are BFFs, so my job is much more enjoyable. Story 25. He just wouldn't work. Just wouldn't. This was in a research lab. He was a visiting researcher from another country, and he spent a lot of time asking tons of non-work-related questions, to the point of disrupting others' work. In the course of a year, he designed one very basic experiment and didn't actually do it, just designed it. He was above doing bench work, apparently. He picked fights with everyone doing any experiment related to the one he was planning because he didn't want to have to share credit for anyone. He wouldn't clean up after himself, wouldn't pick up things from the floor. He actually called me in from another room because he wouldn't take a stringless tea bag out of his mug. Also on a different occasion, because he'd knocked some things off a hanger on the back of the door and for whatever reason wouldn't pick them up. It was kind of like working with a child. He must have had servants where he lived. I don't know how, but he was there for his PhD. Boss fired him. He was one of 2 people in her 30-plus year career that she'd ever fired. Edit, 90 messages. Whoa. In the interest of not inspiring, reinforcing any stereotypes, I won't name the country. Such a person could come from many, and I dare say any country, honestly. Story 26. I worked at a grocery store, and one of the scheduling ladies was a total C-bomb. When you work at a grocery store, you expect to have shifts all over the place. That's part of the job, so I'm not complaining about that. Just about 2 years into working there, I had an accident and broke my thumb hand. Not while at work, unfortunately, LOL, and needed surgery. I went to apply for employment insurance, EI, and they required a record of employment, ROE. So I asked the woman in charge of that, the aforementioned scheduling lady, if she would mind sending that off so I could still pay rent while I was off work recovering. BTW, she told me she already had. So I go back to the EI offices and they told me they still had no ROE. So I go back to my old work and ask her a second time. This happens until I asked her to do it 4 times. This resulted in me having to borrow money from my parents for Christmas in order to pay my rent. Story 27. At my first job, vet assistant at a small animal clinic, there was this middle-aged woman. She primarily worked as the receptionist, who was constantly snarky and rude towards me and my work. After sharing with another coworker that I was planning to go to school to become a vet, she, the receptionist, laughed at me and said, "I don't think I could see you as a vet." I was only 16 years old, mind you. I had big dreams and goals, and I was taking solid steps towards achieving them. I remember standing there taken aback and honestly holding back tears or any indication that I was upset. I was accepted to vet school at age 18, and I am still in school actively pursuing that dream. Guess I'm going to prove her wrong. Eat it. To clarify, I was accepted into an early entry program for vet school. That is how I was accepted at 18. I am in pre-vet undergrad currently, but I have been pre-accepted to vet school with a guaranteed seat waiting for me in my school's CVM after I finish my prereqs. No more application required. Edit 2. Your kind comments really mean a lot to me. Thank you all. I'm working hard and following my goals and dreams, not for her, for me, and most importantly, for all of the animals I will hopefully have the opportunity to help one day. Story 22. The CEO's girlfriend was a devout vegan who would patrol the office around lunch to make sure that anyone who was eating meat promised not to use the sponge in the kitchen to wash anything that meat had touched. She did this in yoga pants and heels, but because her personality sucked, she wasn't remotely attractive. For April's Day, I rinsed out a carton of chicken broth and filled it with mango juice, and made a point of pouring myself a glass and drinking it in front of her. She was disgusted, so it was twice as delicious. Edit. She is both the financial manager and the HR person, so every problem that anyone had at the company became pillow talk between her and her fiancé, and he would sprinkle in the things she told him at meetings as if the problems were supposed to be common knowledge. This pair was a piece of work. He had been overheard saying, "I wouldn't care if I didn't hear music again in my life." Who says that? Sociopaths, that's who. I was eventually fired, and the official reason was that I had photoshopped grotesque images of several people in the office. What she failed to mention to the Department of Labor rep was that I had done it on my own time, on my own computer, and each coworker had requested I do them next after I initially just did it to myself. My own photo just had my eyes move farther apart, so I looked abnormal, but not outside of the realm of possibility. For other coworkers, I flipped their faces upside down, made their eyes too big, removed their noses, facial hair, or covered their mouths up with beards. During my Department of Labor chat to work out my unemployment, the agent asked me to email her the photos, and it made her audibly laugh. Being fired was worth it just for that. Story 29. 3-person department. Myself, an awesome dude, and this terrible new coworker. She was fresh out of college and believed that she was smarter than myself and our other team member because of that. She totally discounted anyone's opinions except her own, and one manager that let her do whatever she wanted. She was the worst one-upper than I'd ever met. Even for stupid things like going to a coffee stand, she'd chime in and say how her friends work at a coffee stand and they know her order by heart. Just stupid stuff. She thought she was adorable and charming, but was incredibly grating and worthless. She constantly messed up on her job, but if you tried to help or give any constructive feedback, she'd cry and go to her wet nurse, aka the one manager that liked her. She lasted almost 4 years, which blew my mind. She was furloughed at the beginning of Corona, but will not be returning as her position is being taken by the owner's daughter. The company split about 2 years ago. I went to the new company and she and awesome dude stayed at the old one. Story 30. I've had a bunch, but bag salad was the worst. It was my job to train her on a position only I knew how to do, and they lied when they said I would definitely be involved in the interview process. I'm still not sure why they did that. No hyperbole, but I crushed that job. Exemplary reviews every year and positive relationships all around. I didn't need or want the help, but they said they were hiring her for the anticipated future workload. It's been so long, I don't even remember why she got that nickname, but it really suited her somehow. She was gluten-free, and whenever food came up at all in any conversation she could overhear, she would bring that up. And she spoke in this confused, sing-songy way like, "Oh, I'm not sure if I can have that. Do Twizzlers have gluten? I'm gluten-free." She didn't understand how to take messages, reply to or forward emails or print anything. She spoke to herself all day long in this half-whisper lip-smacking way like, okay, if I just copy, oh no, maybe move it, but oh, okay, maybe I'll, and would then turn to me with buggy eyes waiting for me to acknowledge her rather than just asking. Her nose whistled with every breath, but when she breathed through her mouth, she would smack her lips or tongue. She loved Big Bang Theory and would regale me with the plot lines of episodes she'd watch, including, and then the Sheldon, goes bazinga, and oh, how I laughed. Goodness, it's so funny. He. Oh, she felt the need to jump in on every conversation she was able to overhear. If I was talking to a friend about a trip or something, me, man, Chicago was great. I hope I can go again someday. Her, oh, I never went to Chicago, but my uncle's friend did in the 80s, and he said he had fun. He used to have a garage where he built widgets, and one time his wife crashed their car in the city they lived. Was it Town A? Town B? I'm not sure, but she was really nice. This one time. I hated her. I know it sounds like a woman out of her depth who was just trying to fit in, and that's true. But some people just grate, and she grated every last nerve and ounce of patience I had. I tried. I just couldn't hack it, and I quit that job 2 months after she started. Story 31. In the interview, something along the lines of, "You're quite young. How do we know you'll be responsible enough to work with our team?" As if she was running an Olympic team and not a fast food joint. I know this is not an unusual question, but her attitude spoke more than her words. Well, I was technically homeless, a young teenager at the time, staying in a shelter. I explained this being my motivation. I needed a day program, wanted a permanent place to live, and someday be comfortable enough financially to go back to school. Before I was homeless, I had amazing grades in school, volunteered with the Red Cross and a few other organizations, babysat for many families, had my babysitting course, and first aid training. So it wasn't as if I had a terrible resume, but she talked down to me as if I should be kissing the ground she walked on, just because she provided me with an interview. Well, a week or two went by, and I didn't hear back from them, so I assumed I didn't get the job. Third week, I get the call and was told to come in later that week for training. Once again, such attitude. She didn't ask, she didn't offer, she demanded I be there. Well, I had gotten another job, but was more than willing to work 2 jobs to achieve my goals. My very first day, on my very first shift, I was given the most basic instructions. Read the employee handbook, then come get her. It took me no time. She was adamant I was illiterate because I was so quick, so I must not have read it. She was pointing to random words, getting me to read them. It was annoying, but goals, homeless and all. She walked me over to a till, put me in a headset, and told the other woman at the till to make me do all the work. I tried my best, but zero training on anything, no guidance. On a weekday lunch rush in an industrial area, it went bad, fast. Mid-order, she grabbed my arm and dragged me into the office. She berated me for a solid 10 minutes on how I was just some pathetic, disgusting, homeless scum with no manners. No wonder no one wanted me. No wonder I was homeless. How pathetic. Honestly, it makes me cry thinking about how cruel and harsh she was. She had no idea I was homeless because my parents were beating me, starving me, neglecting me. No, she just knew I was this young, homeless piece of... I took it, not a tear in front of her. I knew if I cried, well, let's just say had I had a therapist then, I would have been diagnosed with battered women's syndrome much sooner. I knew not to cry. Finally, she was done. I took off the headset, went to the staff room to change, grabbed my stuff, and left. No one said a word to me. I just left. Once in the parking lot, just far enough away to be in the same lot, but in front of another business. I fell to my knees and began crying. Rage crying, sobbing, crocodile tears, full-on breakdown. You know the kind. It feels like you won't ever stop crying. Someone came up to me and put her arm around me. I just cried in her arms. When I was done, I finally saw who it was. It was the assistant manager from the exact place I just left. I was flustered and furious and embarrassed. She just looked at me and told me, "Manager is a bitch. So much so, she is actually being fired this week, and I will be promoted to her position. What she did was so wrong. If it's okay with you, I would still like to hire you. I think you would be a great asset." We had a brief discussion about the current manager, how the owners would hear about what she had done to me, and if I still wanted the job, she would contact me later in the week to arrange a schedule for me. I went in that Saturday, met the owners before a staff meeting where they introduced the newly promoted manager, explained the previous manager had been let go, and introduced me to the team. I was offered the job with a slight wage increase. I think minimum wage was around 2.2 FTDR, and I was given 2.45 here. I worked there for nearly 10 years. I got my high school diploma, went to college, literally became an adult there, and worked my way up the chain of command. Well, as high as I could since the manager was so incredible, the turnover rate was crazy low. Literally my best and worst bosses of all time at that place. Being almost 25, 30 years ago, obviously no FB and I haven't kept in touch with much of the crew, but some days I think back on that place, the staff, the customers, the friends, and hope they are all well. Sorry for the long story.